I never thought I'd watch my own father light $2 million on fire, just to prove a point. But there we were, Tuesday morning, ninth floor of a high-rise law firm in downtown Denver, sitting around a polished oak table in a room that smelled like old money and betrayal. I'd just been handed a cashier's check by Mr. Leland, my late grandfather's attorney. The number on it? $2 million. My fingers barely had time to touch the paper before my mother's painted nails clawed it from my grasp and passed it to my father. He didn't flinch, just flipped open the silver Zippo lighter Grandpa had given him 25 years ago and held the flame to the corner of the check. It burned fast. Flames ate through the ink as silence swallowed the room. The ashes dropped into the brass waste bin beside the table like some kind of twisted symbol. No one said a word. My parents just sat back in their chairs, smug, waiting for me to panic. But I didn't, because what they didn't know was this. Grandpa had planned for everything. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a test they just failed. And I was holding the key, literally, to a truth buried deeper than any bank vault. A truth stored in a safety deposit box Grandpa told me to open only after the will reading. A truth he said would protect everything he'd built and expose everything my parents had become. So if you're watching this and you've ever felt like the black sheep in your own family, the one who stayed quiet while others manipulated, schemed, or pretended, you're not alone. I was that person too, until the day I stopped apologizing for doing the right thing. This is not just a story about money. It's a story about boundaries, betrayal, and the brutal clarity that comes when the masks come off. What happens when inheritance becomes a battlefield? What do you do when family turns into your fiercest enemy? And how do you rise, not just richer, but wiser, when everything they try to burn only made you stronger? Hit that like button. Subscribe if you believe that character is worth more than a check. And buckle up, because what happened next made that flaming check look like just the spark before the firestorm. The smoke hadn't even cleared from the brass band before Mr. Leland rose to his feet with the kind of calm authority that made you forget, for just a second, that a family had publicly detonated itself moments earlier. He adjusted his glasses, folded his hands behind his back, and said with surgical precision, "Well, that was unfortunate, but expected." I didn't move. My eyes were still locked on the curling black flakes of what had been a $2 million check. It should have felt like loss, but it didn't. It felt like confirmation, like the final proof of a theory I'd been testing since the day I was old enough to notice that my parents only showed up when money was involved. My mother leaned back in her chair, lips pursed, trying to compose the smug expression she had walked in with. My father, meanwhile, was already regretting the dramatics. He shifted in his chair, his eyes scanning the corners of the conference room like a man looking for exits he hadn't noticed before. He knew, somewhere in the back of his increasingly anxious mind, that he'd just stepped onto a landmine that hadn't exploded yet. "You understand," he finally said, directing his voice at Mr. Leland, but not meeting his eyes. "This doesn't change anything. We will be contesting the will." Harold was clearly not of sound mind when he signed that document. My mother jumped in like she'd been waiting to say it all morning. The medications, the pain, and Mason was constantly in his ear, influencing him, isolating him from his family. I laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, just a single exhale of disbelief. "Family," I said quietly. "You mean the people who showed up to his house with real estate brochures while he was barely conscious?" "Don't take that tone with me," my mother snapped, her mask slipping for just a moment. "You've always played the victim, Mason." Mr. Leland raised a hand before I could answer. "Let me be very clear," he said, opening a separate leather folder that had been sitting untouched until now. "Mr. Thompson's will was signed in the presence of not only myself and my legal partner, but a licensed psychiatrist who evaluated and documented his full cognitive capacity that day. And," he added, with the faintest smile, "the entire signing process was video recorded for verification." My parents froze. That was the first real crack in their armor. "But that's not all," Mr. Leland continued, now pulling out a slim, sealed envelope with my name on it. "Mason, this is for you. Per your grandfather's instructions, you are to visit Box 722 at High Plains Bank immediately following today's meeting. You know the key. I did. I carried that small brass key in my pocket every day for 3 months like it was a secret compass pointing toward some truth only my grandfather and I understood. Mr. Leland turned his attention back to my parents. Should you choose to pursue legal action, be advised. Mr. Thompson left behind not only financial records, but also written documentation, emails, and audio recordings of prior conversations, many of which clearly indicate your intent to dispute this will regardless of its content. You can't be serious, my father said, though now his voice held no conviction. Oh, I'm afraid he was very serious, Mr. Leland replied, and very thorough. Silence filled the room, thick and stagnant like the air after a summer thunderstorm. No one moved. No one dared speak next. Eventually, my mother stood, smoothed down her designer skirt, and gave me a long, unreadable look. "Enjoy your blood money," she said, each syllable laced with venom. "But don't expect a phone call when this all blows up in your face." She left without looking back. My father hesitated, his hand gripping the back of his chair. "You think you've won," he said, more to himself than to me. "But money changes people, Mason, and not always for the better." "Maybe," I replied, "but character reveals them." He followed her out, slower, like a man walking off a stage after realizing the audience had been booing the whole time. When the door closed, it felt like the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Mr. Leland sat down, looked at me over his glasses, and said quietly, "He trusted you, Mason. Not because you were blood, but because you were better." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. But inside me, something shifted. I wasn't just the good grandson anymore. I wasn't just the bystander to their chaos. I was now the steward of a legacy built on grit, not greed. And it was time to find out exactly what Grandpa Samuel had left behind in that safety deposit box, and what he wanted me to do with it. Because if the check was just a test, then Box 722 was the real beginning. By the time I stepped into the marble-tiled lobby of High Plains Bank, the autumn sun had started its slow descent behind the Rockies, casting long, slanted beams of golden light across the Denver skyline. I could still feel the phantom heat of that burning check in my palm, though my fingers now clutched something far colder. A small brass key engraved with nothing but the number 722. The manager was already waiting for me when I arrived. A tall woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair, pulled into a no-nonsense bun, and a clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge of quiet authority. "Mr. Carter," she said, nodding, "your grandfather was one of our oldest clients. He gave very specific instructions regarding this visit." I followed her past the tellers, through 2 sets of reinforced glass doors, and down a narrow hallway lit with recessed lights that barely flickered. At the end stood the vault, an imposing metal structure that looked less like a bank installation and more like something out of a Cold War bunker. She turned the key from her side, then stepped aside to let me insert mine. The lock clicked with a satisfying finality. The door groaned open. Inside was a steel drawer, longer than I expected and heavier than I was ready for. I slid it onto the viewing table in the private room adjacent to the vault, the door closing behind me with a mechanical hiss. Alone now, I reached for the envelope resting on top, cream-colored, thick paper, and sealed with a deep red wax stamp I recognized instantly. Grandpa had used that seal for anything personal. Letters, journals, once even a Christmas card that said nothing but "spend time, not money." On the front, in his precise, looping script, "Watch this first, Mac." I peeled it open and found a flash drive and a short note. Laptop in drawer. Plug in. Headphones on. No distractions. I did exactly as instructed. The laptop was there as promised. As I powered it up and slid on the noise-canceling headphones, my hand shook. Not from fear, not from grief, something more electric. Anticipation, like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing the next step might just be the one that changes everything. When the video loaded, his face filled the screen. Grandpa, not sick and sunken like he'd been near the end, but alert, present. Filmed, I guessed, about 6 weeks before he passed. He wore a denim shirt, sleeves rolled up, sitting at his old workbench in the cabin by the lake. The same place where he first taught me to use a level, to respect tools, to build with intention. "Hey, kiddo," he said, smiling, voice rough but strong. "If you're watching this, then the fireworks show went off just as I expected. I'm sorry you had to be there for it, but I needed them to show their teeth." He paused, leaning forward, arms resting on the table like he was speaking across coffee cups, not the void. "Your dad, he wasn't always like this, you know? There was a time I believed he could become more than just someone who chases the image of success. But somewhere along the line, he stopped measuring worth by work and started counting it in square footage and imported leather. I gave too much without asking for responsibility. That's on me. But I didn't make that mistake twice." He looked directly into the camera. "I watched you grow, Mason. Watched how you handled rejection, how you stood your ground when they pushed. I knew early on you were the one who'd get it. Not just the money, the weight, the mission." He reached off camera, brought back a thick journal. "This journal holds the full record. Every loan, every lie, every time they asked for help and what they did with it. If they contest anything, this is your defense. But more than that, it's a map of what not to become." He set the journal aside, pulled another item into frame. A manila folder, marked Phase 2. "This," he said, "is where it begins for real. Inside that folder is everything you need to launch the next chapter of the Carter legacy. A new trust, one with your name at the top, and over $7 million earmarked not just to build wealth, but to build people. Scholarships, trade programs, affordable housing. You decide, you lead, but do it with the same hands you built that treehouse with. Steady, honest." He leaned back then, exhaling. "And Mason, they will come. With their apologies, their performances, their pleas. Some might be real. Most won't. Trust actions, not words." His face softened. "Forgive if you can, but never at the cost of your peace. You are not their bank. You are your own man. And I'm proud, so damn proud, of who you've become." The screen faded to black. I pulled the headphones off slowly, the silence in the vault now deafening, like the world had shifted around me and no one else had noticed yet. I sat there for a long time, long enough for the screen to go to sleep, long enough for the gravity of it all to sink in. Grandpa didn't just leave me money. He left me a mission, a blueprint, a challenge. And sitting in that sterile, steel-lined room, I made a quiet vow. I would honor his name not with extravagance, but with impact, not with vengeance, but with vision. I would not let their fire be the final chapter, because the real legacy of Samuel Carter had just begun, and it had nothing to do with what could be burned. The following morning, Denver woke to an unexpected chill, the kind that sneaks in early, reminding you fall doesn't last forever. I stood at the window of my apartment, mug of black coffee in hand, staring out at the city I'd grown up in but never really felt at home in until now. Somehow, after all that had happened, it no longer felt like I was walking someone else's streets. It felt like I'd finally stepped into my own shoes. On the table behind me sat the Phase 2 folder, untouched since I left the bank. I hadn't opened it yet, not because I was afraid, but because I knew once I did, there would be no turning back. No more hiding. No more hesitating. That folder contained the launch codes for a life my grandfather had quietly prepared me for without ever saying it aloud. He trusted me not just with money, but with a mission, and missions demand action. I picked up my phone, hesitating only for a breath before tapping send on a scheduled email that would go out at 9 a.m. sharp to the local press, Grandpa's construction company board members, the foundation's legal partners, and a handful of people he'd trusted enough to involve in his endgame. Attached was the video, his final message, the one he'd recorded in that lakeside cabin. I'd added no edits, no introduction, just his words, his eyes, his unshakable clarity. By 9:17, my inbox was on fire. Reporters called. Board members emailed. 2 local news stations left voicemails asking for interviews. One national podcast host asked if I'd be willing to talk about financial abuse inside wealthy families. And just after 10 a.m., I got a text from my father. It was short. "We need to talk. Privately. Today." I didn't reply. Instead, I drove out to a community center on the north side of town, the same one where Grandpa used to volunteer building wheelchair ramps and repairing busted plumbing for senior citizens who couldn't afford to call a contractor. Inside, the rec room still smelled faintly of sawdust and lemon cleaner. The director, a no-nonsense woman named Carla, greeted me with a raised brow and a warm hug. "I saw the video," she said. "About time somebody told the truth about what that man really did for this city." I pulled out the Phase 2 folder and placed it on the table between us. "Carla," I said, voice steady but soft, "how many families come through here every year needing help with rent, food, school supplies?" "Too many," she said without hesitation. "And fewer donations every year." "Not anymore," I said. "This," I tapped the folder, "is the start of something better. I want to use what Grandpa left to build something real. Education programs, small business grants, financial literacy workshops, maybe even housing eventually." She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "He picked the right one, Mason." I left with a plan, a fire under my ribs, and a sense of clarity I'd never felt working on Wall Street spreadsheets and investor portfolios. This wasn't theory anymore. It was practice. It was purpose. Later that night, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city began to glow in gold and amber, I received a knock on the door. Not a call, not a message, a knock. I opened the door to find my mother standing there in a designer coat and heels too high for the cracked sidewalk outside my building. She looked smaller than usual, less polished, like she'd aged overnight. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice low. I stepped aside, unsure if I was making a mistake or writing the next line of a necessary chapter. She didn't sit, just stood in the middle of my living room like she didn't quite recognize it, or maybe didn't recognize me. "You made us look like monsters," she said finally. I met her gaze evenly. "No, you did that. I just stopped protecting the illusion." She flinched, but didn't argue. For the first time in my life, I saw her not as the woman who controlled every dinner conversation with disapproval or strategic silence, but as someone staring into the hollow echo of her own decisions. A woman who realized too late that money can't buy back trust. That control lost its grip when respect walked out the door. "I didn't come to beg," she whispered, "just to say, I wish we'd done it differently." And for a moment, there was something close to vulnerability. I didn't offer comfort, but I didn't shut the door either. Instead, I said what Grandpa once told me after a long night at the cabin when I admitted I didn't understand how to forgive people who kept hurting me. "Forgiveness isn't forgetting, Mom. It's remembering without letting the memory poison you." She nodded, and then she left without asking for a cent. That night, I opened the Phase 2 folder. Inside were legal blueprints for the foundation, donor agreements, seed capital investments, and a single handwritten note from Grandpa. Build more than they ever imagined, and become more than they ever understood. And I would, because this was no longer about inheritance. It was about identity. And I was finally ready to claim mine. I should have known silence from my father meant something was coming. He hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't responded to the viral backlash that followed Grandpa's video being released. No public statement, no denial, not even the half-hearted performative remorse that so often plays well online. But beneath that silence, I could feel it, like the still air before a storm. He wasn't retreating. He was reloading. It came 2 days later in the form of a hand-delivered envelope. Heavy cream stock, thick black wax seal, and the unmistakable handwriting of my father's longtime legal pit bull, Gregory Trask. I sat at the breakfast counter, opened it slowly, and scanned the top line. Notice of intent to file suit for undue influence, fraudulent inducement, and will contestation. I exhaled, not out of shock but recognition. This was the move of a man who didn't care about the money anymore. It wasn't about the trust fund. It wasn't even about the property or the stock portfolios. This was about humiliation. Legacy. My father wasn't trying to win in court. He was trying to scorch the soil behind him on the way out, hoping to drag me through it just to prove he still had reach. I drove to Mr. Leland's office with the letter in my jacket pocket, but it may as well have been a grenade. His assistant, Sandra, met me at the door with a raised brow. "He's expecting you," she said, motioning toward the glass-paneled conference room where we'd first gathered after the will reading. Mr. Leland stood as I entered, his white hair, still perfectly combed, his gray eyes missing nothing. I slid the envelope across the table. He read it carefully, then set it down like it was just another Tuesday. He's gambling, Leland said. Badly, I might add. He doesn't want to win, I said. He just wants a spectacle. Then he may get one, Leland replied, folding his hands. But he's underestimated the paper trail your grandfather left. Again, he pulled a file from a locked drawer, a thick, labeled binder with tabs and timestamps. This is what we call pre-litigation nuclear deterrence. Every voicemail, email, account transfer, and power of attorney authorization your grandfather prepared has been compiled into a timeline. And more importantly, witness testimony. From who? I asked. Leland smiled faintly. From everyone who saw what really happened. Martha, Tyler, his accountant, even 2 former board members who said your father tried to pressure them into pushing Grandpa into a guardianship transfer during his last months. I leaned back, the tension in my shoulders releasing like a string had been cut. You let him make the first move, Leland added, so we get to make the last. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, lights low, the city humming outside. I stared at the ceiling, asking myself the question I'd been avoiding. What if this never ends? Because the truth is, when a parent wages war on their child, not for justice, but ego, there's no real victory. Even when you win, you bleed. And yet, even as that thought settled over me, another followed, clearer, louder, and unmistakably Grandpa's in tone if not in voice. Let them exhaust themselves on the battle, Mac. You stay focused on the rebuild. So I did. The next morning, I stood on the steps of the Jefferson Civic Center, a modest press conference arranged through the Community Foundation. Nothing flashy, just a mic, a banner, and a few folding chairs for the local press. Behind me stood Carla, 2 scholarship recipients, and a lead contractor for our first affordable housing site. The Carter Cottages, 10 eco-efficient units breaking ground in Aurora next spring. I'm not here to defend myself, I told the reporters. Because I don't have to. The truth's already out there. What I'm here to do is begin something my grandfather dreamed of, but didn't live to see. A legacy of financial strength for people who never got a sit at the table. This foundation isn't just about money. It's about rebuilding what greed has broken in families, in systems, in lives. Questions followed, of course. Some respectful, some hungry for scandal. Will you respond to the lawsuit directly? I'll let the courts do their job, I said calmly. But I will say this. If you know someone's going to light the match, you pour water before they strike. The headlines that evening read exactly how I hoped. Carter grandson deflects family lawsuit, launches housing program instead. Back at home that night, I found another envelope slipped under my door. Smaller this time. Handwritten. Dad. Inside, just one sentence. You always did think you were smarter than me. No greeting. No sign-off. Just that. A warning? A threat? A confession? I didn't respond. I filed it with the others. Like a ghost I refused to let haunt me. Because this war wasn't mine. And I had a foundation to build. The summons came 3 days later, thick with legal jargon and the dry scent of printer toner that seems to stick to anything from courthouse. My father had filed formal papers. Carter versus Carter, naming me as the primary respondent in what he called an emergency estate intervention due to potential undue influence and emotional manipulation. He wasn't just suing me. He was suing my character. The hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. Expedited, of course. A move straight out of his playbook. Go fast, go hard, catch them off balance. But I wasn't off balance. I was tired, deeply tired, of being tested, of being forced to defend decency like it was a crime. Mr. Leland assured me it was procedural at best, an opening volley that would backfire under the weight of evidence we had. And still, there was something about seeing your own name on court documents beside the words fraud and coercion that leaves a dent in your ribs. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window again, same black coffee, same city below, but this time the silence didn't comfort me. It felt like a vacuum. That's when my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in over a year. Jordan Reyes. I stared at the screen like it was a ghost. We hadn't spoken since he left for that trauma surgery fellowship in Chicago, and we'd quietly agreed to let distance do what it does best, erase things too delicate to endure it. But the message was simple. Saw you on the news. Want to talk? My first instinct was to delete it, to pretend it never happened. But something in the timing, something about that night, about being dragged into another courtroom by my own father, made me feel like I needed to remember who I was outside of all this. I typed back before I could overthink. Yeah, tomorrow? We met at a quiet coffee shop in Capitol Hill the next afternoon. One of those converted Victorian homes turned into a cafe with creaky floors and low ceilings that smell like cinnamon and old wood. Jordan looked different, not unrecognizable, just weathered. Like he'd seen things, real things, since we last sat across from each other. Hey, he said, sliding into the chair across from me. So, the internet thinks your family's trying to kill each other with court briefs. I smirked, grateful for the levity. And they'd be mostly right. We talked, for an hour, maybe more, about the lawsuit, about the foundation, about how weird it felt to become public overnight for something I never wanted to be famous for. And eventually we talked about us. Do you ever wonder, he asked, if we lost something too soon? Or maybe just at the wrong time? Every damn day, I said. But that doesn't mean I blame you for leaving. You shouldn't. It was right for then. But now, he paused. Now I see you out there, standing up to everything, fighting back with grace. And I just wondered, is there room for something real in your life? Not headlines, not legacy, just real. I didn't answer right away, because for the first time in months, someone wasn't asking me to explain myself, or defend myself, or shoulder a name I hadn't asked to carry. They were asking if I still knew how to be me. And the truth is, I wasn't sure, but I wanted to find out. So I said, come to court next Friday. Sit in the gallery. If you still want to ask me that question after hearing everything my father says about me, then yeah, maybe there's still room. That week moved slow. Headlines swirled. Social media lit up. Millionaire heir dragged to court by his own father. Talk shows speculated. Comment sections flared. But I stayed focused. On prep. On the foundation. On building. On breathing. And on the silence between messages from Jordan, which somehow made everything feel calmer. The night before the hearing, I walked into Grandpa's old study, now rebuilt inside the foundation's downtown office. I lit the antique desk lamp, ran my fingers across the grain of the oak desk he'd refinished himself, and whispered out loud, "They're going to throw everything at me tomorrow. How did you handle it when the world doubted you?" The silence didn't answer, but the photo beside the lamp did. Him, in overalls, sawdust in his beard, a hammer slung casually over one shoulder. That smirk, that look that said, they can't take anything from you that you don't hand over first. So I didn't plan to hand over a damn thing. Tomorrow, I'd walk into court, and for once, I wouldn't walk in afraid of what I might lose. I'd walk in standing for what I've already found. The morning of the hearing, the sky was gunmetal gray, low clouds hanging heavy over Denver, threatening rain that never quite arrived. I stood in front of the courthouse, suit pressed, tie straight, and a heart that beat in a slow, steady rhythm. Not from fear, not from pride, from something else entirely, resolve. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation. Journalists lined the back row, scribbling in pads they barely glanced at. Phones buzzed on silent. A few curious faces from the community I'd come to know through the foundation filled the gallery. And at the end of the third row, just like I asked, Jordan sat with his hands folded in his lap, watching me with eyes that made it clear, "You're not alone in this." My parents entered 5 minutes before the judge. My mother, all nerves masked in beige cashmere and pearls. My father, stoic in a navy suit, jaw clenched like it was wired shut. He didn't look at me as he passed, but I didn't expect him to. You can't meet the eyes of someone you're trying to tear down in public and still pretend it's for love. Judge Halvorsen took the bench, an older man with thinning silver hair and a pair of reading glasses that spent more time in his hands than on his face. He reviewed the file in silence for nearly a minute, the kind of silence that makes grown men adjust their collars and attorneys sit straighter. "We are here today," he said finally, "to consider a petition brought forth by Richard and Elaine Carter regarding the estate of the late Samuel Carter. Specifically, whether the named heir, Mason Carter, exercised undue influence over the decedent, and whether the existing will and trust arrangements were the product of such influence. He looked up, sharp eyes sweeping the room. Let's be clear, this is not about hurt feelings. This is a matter of law. The proceedings began with my father's attorney, Gregory Trask, taking the floor, delivering a speech as polished as it was insidious. He painted a picture of me as a conniving manipulator, isolating my grandfather, separating him from his son and rightful family, and whispering ideas about legacy and justice into the ears of a dying man too weak to argue. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink, because I'd heard those lies before, just never under oath. Then came their first witness, my mother. She took the stand in her finest pearls, voice trembling just enough to sound believable, telling the court how concerned she and my father had been about Grandpa's state of mind in his final weeks, how they only ever wanted what was best for him, and how I seemed determined to shut them out. When she finished, I saw the tears in her eyes. Real or rehearsed, I couldn't tell anymore. And maybe that was the saddest part, that I no longer knew the difference. My turn came that afternoon. As I stood up, walking slowly to the stand, I felt the weight of every headline, every accusation, every legacy tied to my last name pressing down like a second spine. But I also felt something else. Every weekend spent caring for Grandpa. Every whispered conversation. Every hard-earned lesson about responsibility and restraint. The court clerk swore me in. I looked to the judge, then to the room, and began. My name is Mason Carter. I'm 29 years old. I'm the founder of the Carter Foundation for Financial Access. I was also Samuel Carter's grandson, caretaker, and, above all, his student. I told him about the time he let me hammer nails for the first time and made me pull them all out when I bent them. About how he believed mistakes weren't final unless you stopped learning. About how he lived modestly not because he had to, but because it let him give more. I spoke clearly, but not dramatically. No theatrics, just truth. He taught me to listen before speaking, to measure twice, cut once, and to treat money not as a prize, but as a tool. I paused. And yes, he changed his will, but not because I asked him to. He changed it because he saw through the people who only came around when they needed something. People who spent decades taking, then acted betrayed when the giving stopped. I didn't look at my parents when I said it, but the courtroom did. Mr. Leland followed with documentation, the recordings, the signed statements, the financial ledger. Martha's written testimony, Tyler's sworn affidavit. Evidence stacked like bricks in a wall no argument could punch through. But the moment that truly shifted the room wasn't legal. It was personal. Judge Halvorson leaned forward after the final exhibits had been admitted. Mr. Carter, he said, do you believe your grandfather made these decisions freely? I met his eyes, calm and certain. I believe he made the hardest choices of his life in the clearest state of mind he ever had. And I believe he trusted me to carry them forward without flinching. The judge nodded slowly. Thank you. As I stepped down, I glanced toward the gallery. Jordan was still there, hands folded, eyes steady, and as I passed my parents' table, for the first time in this entire ordeal, I saw fear on my father's face. Not fear of losing the money, but fear that I might win the one thing he'd spent a lifetime trying to own. The Carter name. The hearing ended not with gavel slams and dramatic declarations, but with something far more brutal, silence. Not the kind that offers peace, the kind that leaves room for disappointment to echo. Judge Halvorson, in his measured, composed voice, stated what I already knew in my bones. The petition lacks merit. The decedent's mental competency has been verified by multiple parties. The estate stands as written. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. Justice, when it lands correctly, doesn't ask for applause. My father sat back in his chair like the air had been knocked out of him. My mother, still trying to hold onto some shred of dignity, dabbed her eyes with a folded tissue she'd barely used. Their attorney conferred with them in hushed tones, already talking appeal. But they weren't listening anymore, because it was over, legally at least. But outside that courtroom, I was about to find out just how long shadows could stretch after the spotlight fades. As we stepped into the marble-lined hallway, reporters clustered like vultures. Microphones, cameras, flashes, voices shouting questions not because they wanted answers, but because chaos makes good TV. Mr. Carter, how do you feel about defeating your own father in court? Was the money worth the family fallout? Will the foundation return funds to your parents if they apologize publicly? I didn't stop. I didn't speak. Mr. Leland raised his hand in calm dismissal as we walked past them, the wall of noise closing behind us like a wave crashing into steel. In the parking garage, I finally exhaled. It's done, I said out loud, though part of me still didn't believe it. Mr. Leland placed a hand on my shoulder. No, Mason, he said quietly. The fight is done. But the consequence? That's just beginning. And he was right. That weekend, my name trended nationally. Some called me a hero, the grandson who fought back. Others called me a traitor, the ingrate who stole from his own parents. Strangers debated my morality with more passion than they brought to elections. One news outlet ran an opinion piece calling me a case study in generational fracture. Another praised the foundation's mission but called the public family rift a PR liability for donors. I ignored most of it, but what I couldn't ignore was the silence from my parents. Not a word, no appeal filed, no apology issued, no olive branch extended. Just silence. It should have felt like peace. It didn't. It felt like exile, but it also felt like freedom, because now, finally, I could build. We broke ground on the Carter cottages the following Thursday. 10 affordable homes on land Grandpa bought decades ago and held on to, waiting for someone in the family to do something real with it. We had volunteers from 4 nonprofits. Local press came, not for scandal this time, but for hope. There were handshakes, back slaps, people who'd never known Samuel Carter, but who now quoted him like scripture. And somewhere in the middle of it, I realized something. This was never about inheritance. It was about intention. And maybe that's why Grandpa left it all to me. Not because I was better than the rest, but because I'd spent my life listening to what wasn't said. That night, after the first foundation stone was laid, I stood on the edge of the site, boots covered in red dirt, hands sore, heart steadier than it had been in months. The sun was setting behind the foothills, casting everything in gold. Jordan hadn't texted. My parents hadn't called. But I wasn't waiting anymore, because some endings don't come with apologies, and some beginnings don't need permission. They just need someone brave enough to start. And I had finally started. It was supposed to be a simple walkthrough, just a quiet visit to the construction site at Carter Cottages, nothing more than a progress check. The concrete had been poured for the foundations, and the framework of the first 2 houses was already rising like skeletons against the early morning sky. The air smelled like sawdust and wet dirt, the kind of smell that reminded me of my childhood weekends at Grandpa's lake cabin, helping him build shelves that never sat quite straight, but always stood firm. I didn't expect to find anything. But the universe has a way of waiting until your guard is down to toss a brick through the window. It was Luis, one of the volunteer foremen, who called out from the far corner of the lot, behind where Unit 4 would eventually stand. "Hey, Mr. Carter," he said, waving me over. "We found something in the foundation wall. Thought you might want to see it." I walked over, expecting maybe an old bottle or a piece of rusted piping, but what he handed me made my pulse stutter. A metal box, small and square, the kind you'd bury or hide, not something that ends up at a construction wall by accident. It was sealed shut with a simple clasp. No lock, no key. I opened it. Inside was an envelope, aged, yellowed, corners fraying, and on it, in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting, to Mason. Only open when you've built something with your own 2 hands. My fingers froze. The edges of the paper felt brittle, like one wrong move might shatter the whole thing into dust. I stepped away from the others, found a quiet patch near the tree line, and sat on the cool grass. For a minute, I just stared at it. That handwriting, that message. He knew this day would come. I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter. "Mac, if you're reading this, it means you've done what I hoped you would. Built something real, something that lives beyond you, something that wasn't handed down but forged in sweat and sacrifice. And now that you have, it's time to tell you the rest. There's another property. You won't find it in the trust documents. I left it off the books on purpose. It's in Idaho, up near the Clearwater River. 40 acres of land I bought back in the 80s under a different name. I planned to build something there, something simple. But life, as it does, got complicated. The deed is in the possession of an old friend. Name's Thomas Avery. He's a retired carpenter, lives in Lewiston now. If you want it, go find him. He'll know who you are. He always said you had the look of someone who asks the right questions. You don't have to do anything with the land. You've already done more than I could have ever asked. But I thought, maybe one day, you'd want to build something without the name Carter attached to it. Just yours. No legacy. No burden. Just the freedom to begin. I love you, Mac. Always have. Always will. Grandpa. I read it twice. Then a third time. And still my hands trembled. Because this wasn't just another surprise asset. It wasn't a trapdoor of inheritance he'd forgotten to tell me about. It was something entirely different. It was permission. Permission to step out from under the shadow of the Carter name and into the sunlight of something I could create entirely on my own. And suddenly, I wasn't sure I was ready. Back at the site, Luis asked if everything was okay. I nodded, but inside my mind raced. Because what Grandpa had given me wasn't just a piece of land. It was a question, one I'd been avoiding ever since the will was read, ever since the courtroom, the lawsuits, the foundation, the press. What do you want your life to be if no one else is watching? That night, I couldn't sleep. The letter lay on my desk like a quiet dare, whispering possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider. My whole life had been about living up to something, expectations, responsibilities, reputations. But this was a blank canvas. The next morning, I booked a flight to Idaho. Not because I had a plan, but because for the first time in a long time, I wanted to walk into the unknown without needing to prove anything to anyone. Not to my parents, not to the board, not to the world. Just to myself. The flight to Lewiston was quiet, almost too quiet. I sat by the window, eyes fixed on the checkerboard of farmland and forest below as the plane descended into a town that seemed to have slipped off the edge of time. No high-rises, no billboards, just pine-covered hills and streets that moved like memories instead of traffic. It was the kind of place people forgot existed until they needed to remember who they were. I rented a truck that still had dirt in the wheel wells and an air freshener shaped like a fir tree. The clerk handed me the keys and said, "You're not from around here, are you?" I gave him a half smile and said, "Not lately." I didn't explain. He didn't ask. The address Grandpa had scribbled in the margins of the letter led me 15 miles out of town, down a winding gravel road where cell service gave up trying, and every curve looked like it belonged in a storybook. I passed logging trucks, a field of rusted tractors, and a one-room church with a crooked steeple before I saw it. A white farmhouse, sagging slightly, but still standing, like a man who knows his bones are old, but his heart's still strong. I parked by the fence, dust settling behind me in the breeze, and stepped out. A man in denim overalls and a canvas shirt was kneeling by the porch, hammering in a loose plank. He looked up, eyes squinting against the light, and for a long second, neither of us said a word. Then he stood, stretched his back, and said, "You've got Sam's eyes." "Thomas Avery?" I asked. He nodded. "You must be Mason." I followed him into the house, the screen door slamming softly behind us. Inside, it smelled of cedar and old paper. Photos lined the mantel, faded black and white images of carpenters standing beside half-finished barns, weddings held in churchyards, fishing trips from a time before digital anything. He poured 2 mugs of coffee, no cream, no sugar, and handed one to me like he already knew I needed it strong and simple. "I've been waiting for you," he said. "Sam told me you'd come someday. Figured it'd be sooner, honestly. I didn't know this place existed until last week." "That was the point," he said, his voice as worn as the floor beneath us. "Sam didn't want you to find it until you were ready." I pulled the letter from my jacket pocket, unfolded it, and laid it on the table between us. He didn't look at it. "I don't need to read it," he said. "I know what it says, and I know what he left for you." I waited. He stood, walked to a cabinet in the corner, and pulled out a thin file folder. Inside was a deed, stamped and notarized, with a name I didn't recognize, Samuel Ellis. Grandpa's mother's maiden name. "This is yours now," Thomas said, sliding it across the table. 40 acres, mostly forested. One clearing with an old foundation. He started building there once. Didn't get far. Said he wasn't ready to finish something that was meant for someone else. I swallowed hard. The idea that he'd come here, started something, then stopped, left it like a buried message for me to finish. It hit deeper than I expected. Why didn't he ever tell me about this? Thomas sipped his coffee. Because he wanted to see who you became before he gave you a place to become it. I drove out that afternoon, following his directions to the edge of the property. There was no gate, no signs, just 2 tire tracks disappearing into a sea of pine and fir. I followed them until the trees opened up into a meadow, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. And there it was, the foundation, just concrete and stone covered in moss, with one wooden beam still standing like a flagpole planted in memory. I stood there for a long time, not thinking, not planning, just being. The wind picked up. A hawk circled overhead. Somewhere nearby, water moved over rocks. The river, maybe, or a stream feeding into it. I took off my jacket, sat on the edge of the old foundation, and let the silence wash over me like a baptism. This wasn't about building a house. It wasn't even about building a legacy. It was about building something real, and maybe for the first time in a long time, something for me. Back in town, before I returned the truck, I stopped by the general store, bought a spiral notebook, a mechanical pencil, and a map of the region. I didn't know what the next steps were, but I knew this. I was going to return. Not for business, not for press, just to build. Maybe something small, maybe something I never put my name on. Because sometimes the purest kind of legacy isn't the one that carries your name. It's the one that carries your values. And this land, this quiet, waiting piece of earth was where I could finally do that. It started with the sound of wind through pine, steady, indifferent old. The kind of sound that didn't care about courtrooms or headlines or the Carter name printed on press releases. I had arrived at the clearing before dawn, coffee still hot in a thermos, and the truck's engine ticking in the cool air. The sky was just beginning to bleed from black into navy, the stars fading one by one like tired ghosts heading home. I stepped out, boots crunching against frost-hardened soil, and stood at the edge of the forgotten foundation, the mossy rectangle in the dirt that Grandpa never finished. A single beam still stood, angled slightly, as if stubbornly refusing to collapse with time. I walked to it, touched it, and whispered, "We'll start here. Not rebuild, not restore. Start." There was no construction crew, no ribbon cutting, no architects with rolled-up blueprints and city permits tucked in leather folders. Just me, a notebook with sketches, some rough measurements, and the worn hammer Grandpa gave me on my 17th birthday. Steel head, hickory handle, initials scratched into the side like a secret pass from one pair of hands to the next. The first nail went in with more effort than grace. My hand wasn't used to this work anymore. My grip was stiff from months of typing instead of lifting. But by the third nail, the rhythm came back. And with it, something deeper, something quieter than pride, softer than nostalgia. Purpose. Not inherited, not expected, chosen. I spent the day cutting and measuring, resetting the frame, clearing brush, leveling corners, and thinking more clearly than I had in months. No noise except the birds. No meetings. No attorneys. No eyes watching for mistakes. Just wood and dirt and sky. At noon, I stopped to eat, cold sandwich, thermos coffee, and an apple that bruised on the drive. I sat on an overturned log, looked out at the forest, and let the silence answer a question I hadn't asked out loud. What does life feel like when no one else is scripting it for you? It felt honest. Later, as the sun started to dip behind the treetops, casting long golden fingers across the clearing, I stood and looked at what I had done. It wasn't much, just the start of a frame. But it was real, imperfect, earned. I took out Grandpa's letter again, reread the last lines, and thought about what he'd meant when he wrote, "Maybe one day, you'll want to build something without the name Carter attached to it." He was giving me permission not to carry the legacy, but to transform it. And that night, as I sat by a small fire I built near the edge of the trees, wrapped in an old canvas jacket, staring up at a sky so wide it made city skylines feel like cages, I realized something that both broke me and built me at the same time. I wasn't here to escape my name. I was here to earn it, not through wealth, not through lawsuits won or foundations built, but through the quiet act of creation, of sweating over a piece of land no one knew existed and choosing to make it beautiful anyway. I thought about my father, not the man who stood in a courtroom trying to tear me down, but the boy Grandpa once held on his shoulders at the county fair, the man he once hoped would build more than appearances. Somewhere along the way, he forgot how to be small, forgot how to be real. I wouldn't. As the fire crackled and coyotes howled in the distance, I wrote in my notebook, "This place doesn't need to be big. It doesn't need to be profitable. It just needs to be mine." And true, the stars came back one by one, silent and bright, unbothered by legacy or reputation or money. And as I lay back on the earth, no roof, no walls, just sky above and dirt below, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day Grandpa first taught me to drive a nail straight. Peace, not the kind that comes from victory, the kind that comes from choosing yourself, finally, over everything they told you to become. When I returned to Denver, the air felt different. It wasn't just the elevation or the late autumn bite starting to creep into the breeze. It was something internal. A weight lifted, maybe, or maybe a new kind of gravity. I hadn't changed who I was in Idaho, but I'd stripped away everything that wasn't mine to carry anymore. Back in the city, the Carter Foundation office had grown busier. Emails, calls, community partners requesting meetings. The first grant cycle had closed while I was gone, and we'd already selected the first batch of recipients. 5 organizations that help families navigate predatory lending, student debt, and first-time homeownership. Grandpa would have hated the bureaucracy of it all, but loved the outcome. We weren't giving handouts. We were giving power. Then, 3 days after I got back, the envelope arrived. No return address. Just my name on the front, written in my father's familiar slanted print. Inside, a single type page on formal letterhead from his attorney. A proposal. In light of recent events, and for the sake of preserving family dignity, Richard and Elaine Carter hereby request a private meeting to discuss potential restorative arrangements, including the possibility of limited access to Carter Foundation resources under specified conditions. No press. No recordings. 1 hour. It wasn't a lawsuit this time. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. The kind you send not because you've changed, but because your last move failed and you're trying a different angle. I didn't respond for 2 days. Not because I was indecisive, because I needed to decide who I was going to be when I walked into that meeting. The room was the same one we'd once gathered in for the will reading, Mr. Leland's conference room, all oak and understatement. My parents were already seated when I arrived, side by side, as if the performance of unity could erase what came before. My father stood, extended a hand. I looked at it for a full 3 seconds before shaking it. Not out of forgiveness, out of formality. My mother nodded politely, wearing the exact expression of someone who once burned a $9 million check and now wanted to pretend it was a misunderstanding. Mr. Leland took his place at the head of the table, silent as always, but watching closely. My father spoke first. "Mason, thank you for coming." I said nothing. "We understand," he continued, "that things got out of hand. Out of hand. Like it was a dinner conversation gone wrong. Not a courtroom battle to strip me of everything Grandpa had entrusted to me." My mother picked up from there. "We've been reflecting, and we'd like to find a path forward. As a family." I leaned back in a chair, hands folded. "Define forward." She blinked, taken slightly aback by the tone. "We thought perhaps, if there's a discretionary fund within the foundation, a small monthly stipend could—" Mr. Leland cleared his throat. My mother flushed. My father stepped in. "This isn't about money." I raised an eyebrow. He tried again. "It's about reconciliation. Look, we raised you. Maybe not perfectly, but we're still your parents. There must be some part of you that values that." I studied them. The suits, the carefully prepared language, the lack of apology. And then I said it quietly but clearly. "You want access to Grandpa's money, but what you're really asking for is access to his legacy. And that's something you lost long before he died." They didn't speak, so I stood. "I've already made arrangements," I continued. There's a restricted trust, small, modest, designed for you both. Conditional upon monthly financial counseling and full transparency. It doesn't restore what you burned, but it keeps the lights on. If you accept, it begins in January. My mother looked like she'd swallowed something bitter. My father asked, "And if we don't, then it remains where it is," I said, helping people who haven't spent 30 years trading character for credit cards. They didn't stand when I walked out, and that told me everything. That night, as I looked over the final drafts for the Foundation's annual impact report, I wrote a new mission statement at the top of the page. Not for donors, not for branding. For me, we are not what we inherit. We are what we do with it, because money burns. But values? They either die in silence or live through action. And I plan to keep building. One grant, one home, one hard decision at a time. The air was crisp on the morning of the ribbon cutting. Not cold, but sharp, the kind that wakes your skin up and tells you that something new is about to begin. It had rained the night before, leaving the earth dark and rich underfoot, and the scent of wet pine drifted in from the trees like a quiet blessing. The Carter cottages stood ready. 10 homes. Simple, clean, built with intention and integrity. The siding was neutral, the landscaping minimal. No show, no flash, just function and grace. Exactly what Grandpa would have wanted. Exactly what the city needed. Guests were already arriving. Community members, city council reps, journalists with notepads and camera crews. Kids in puffer jackets darting around the gravel paths while their parents smiled shyly, holding the hands of social workers or nonprofit case managers who had walked with them through struggle to this moment of arrival. Mr. Leland stood near the podium, flipping through a small stack of index cards, even though he never used notes when he spoke. Carla wore a navy coat and a grin she'd clearly practiced in the mirror, but never needed to. Jordan arrived quietly, unnoticed by most, until I saw him and nodded. He nodded back. We hadn't spoken since the trial, but we didn't need to, not today. And then I saw her. Martha, 82 years old, K in one hand, determination in the other. One of the Foundation team members helped her down the path. She wore the same wool coat I remembered from every Thanksgiving at Grandpa's house. The button's a little looser now, but still holding fast. She made her way to me and patted my chest lightly. "I told him you'd build something that didn't need his name," she said, her eyes misting. I smiled. I used it anyway. Not because I had to, because it deserved to be honored. She nodded. He'd have liked that. The ceremony began shortly after. The speeches were short. Mr. Leland spoke first, reminding the crowd that legacy isn't about estate law or wealth, but stewardship. Carla followed, detailing the vetting process for the first residents. Families escaping cycles of eviction, seniors priced out of their neighborhoods, single mothers trying to give their children roots they never had. Then they handed me the scissors. I stood in front of the red ribbon, the cottages behind me like a line of quiet promises. I didn't say much, just this. Samuel Carter taught me that wealth means nothing without wisdom. That money without intention can wreck a family faster than poverty ever could. He also taught me that building something real, something that lasts, means putting others first. So today isn't just about cutting a ribbon. It's about cutting the cycle of fear, of instability, of feeling like you don't belong anywhere. Welcome home. I cut the ribbon. The crowd clapped. Not loud, not rowdy, but warm, grateful. As the residents began exploring their homes for the first time, I stepped back, watched a young boy press his palm against a window pane, watched his mother run her fingers across a countertop like it was a piano key, watched an old man sit on a porch step and light a cigarette, shoulders relaxing in a way that said he hadn't done that in years. That night, after everyone had gone home and the porch lights flickered on like stars born from blueprints, I sat on the step of Unit 1 and opened my notebook. At the top of a new page, I wrote, "Not everything that breaks needs to stay broken. Not everyone who leaves has to be shut out forever. But healing is a choice, and it begins with what you build next." My phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "We saw the ribbon cutting on TV. Your father's not ready to reach out. But I wanted to say, the homes are beautiful. You would have liked them. We both would have, once. I hope you're well." I read it twice. then set the phone down beside me. No reply. Not yet, but maybe someday. Maybe. It was nearly spring by the time I made it back to Idaho. The last of the snow had melted into the tree roots and riverbanks, leaving behind a quiet, damp hush that clung to the pines like a second skin. The cabin, my cabin now, stood halfway complete. Framing done, windows in, a roof that didn't leak but still creaked in the wind. I left it that way on purpose. Not unfinished, just waiting. I unpacked a duffel bag, one flannel shirt, a thermos, Grandpa's hammer, and a photo I'd had printed the day after the ribbon cutting. A wide shot of the 10 Carter cottages under a golden sky, children running through the gravel paths, Martha sitting on the steps of Unit 1, her hand resting on the railing like she owned the place. In the photo, I stood off to the side, not smiling, just watching. That was the part no one saw. The moment I realized I didn't need to be the center of anything to carry it forward. I tacked the photo to the wall above the kitchen window, right next to the handwritten blueprint Grandpa had once sketched in a notebook for a simple one-bedroom cabin that faced west. No insulation specs, no plumbing notes, just lines, angles, space, room to breathe, room to become. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting light through the bare trees and long, amber stripes. I stepped out onto the porch, unfinished of course, and leaned against the frame. The clearing stretched out before me, still wild around the edges, still untamed, still mine. I thought of Grandpa, of the journal he left behind, of the recordings, the signatures, the backup plans hidden in plain sight. But more than that, I thought of his patience. He hadn't rushed to save my father from himself. He hadn't forced change on anyone. He had waited, and he'd trusted the long arc of legacy to bend toward character, even if it took a generation longer than he hoped. Inside, the fire crackled in the old stove. Not much of a blaze, just enough to warm the room and make it feel like someone meant to return. I sat in the old chair I'd hauled up the mountain from Denver, notebook in hand, pencil dull from use. I opened it to the last page and wrote, without thinking. I used to think legacy was what you pass down, but now I know it's what you build quietly and leave behind for people you'll never meet. It's what speaks when you're not in the room, and it doesn't need a name on it to be yours. The wind pushed softly at the cabin walls, but they didn't creak. They held. If this story reminded you of someone who shaped your values, someone whose quiet lessons still echo in your choices, share their name in the comments. Let their legacy live on through your words. And if you've ever had to rebuild yourself from the ashes of family or chose integrity over inheritance, let us know how that moment changed you. Hit that like button if this journey moved you. Subscribe for more stories that remind us all. It's not what we're given that defines us. It's what we build when no one's watching. Thank you for walking this road with me. Now, go build something that matters.